"Your ground crew, don't touch the tactical flight board," an officer shouted angrily when he saw the young woman marking detailed combat diagrams in the command center. She stayed completely silent, continuing to check coordinates and high-altitude wind patterns very carefully. 5 minutes later, a signal from an F-16 in active combat crackled over the radio. "Requesting flight lead immediately, code Echo 6. A second later, "Repeat, I only fly when she leads." The command room fell dead silent. Lena Moreau looked like she'd accidentally wandered into the wrong career field. 28 years old, French-Austrian heritage, with brown hair always pulled back in a practical bun, and a small, thin frame that seemed fragile next to the bulky aircraft she serviced. At Tactical Air Base G-47, she was part of the ground support crew, responsible for refueling, aerodynamics checks, and pre-flight troubleshooting. No medals, no flight coordination rank, no authority beyond checking fuel lines and hydraulic systems. But Lena had skills nobody knew about. She could analyze radar signatures, calculate mid-altitude wind speeds, and had taught herself to read thermal scatter radar maps during her off hours. Knowledge she'd acquired through pure curiosity, not military training. The male pilots treated her like part of the equipment. "You should stick to cleaning gauges instead of adjusting radar systems," Captain Morrison had said last week when she corrected a misaligned targeting system. "What does she know besides valve pressure?" Lieutenant Torres added with a dismissive laugh. The comments never stopped. During pre-flight briefings, they'd talk over her technical observations. When she pointed out atmospheric conditions that might affect flight performance, they'd nod politely and ignore her completely. "Ground crew should focus on ground crew work," was the unofficial motto whenever Lena tried to contribute beyond her assigned duties. She'd learned to stay quiet and focus on her job, check fuel systems, test hydraulic pressure, verify wing stability mechanisms, simple, mechanical work that kept the aircraft operational. But Lena saw everything. She noticed when pilots made subtle navigation errors during pre-flight planning. She observed when weather data was misinterpreted or when wind calculations were off by dangerous margins. She watched young aviators make mistakes that could get them killed, and she bit her tongue because speaking up only earned her more ridicule. One afternoon, when the auxiliary wind guidance system malfunctioned, Lena had manually adjusted the stabilizer fins to help an F-16 land safely during crosswinds. The pilot climbed out of his cockpit, checked his instruments, and walked away without acknowledging her intervention. That was normal, expected even. Lena didn't fix things for recognition. She fixed them because aircraft needed to function properly, because pilots needed to come home alive, because the mission mattered more than her ego. What the base personnel didn't know was that Lena spent her evenings studying advanced aerodynamics and flight coordination protocols. She'd acquired textbooks on tactical aviation, meteorology, and radar systems management, not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood that knowledge could save lives. Every night, she'd review the day's flight operations, noting mistakes that hadn't been caught, inefficiencies that could be improved, safety issues that had been overlooked. She kept detailed logs in a small notebook, analyzing patterns and developing solutions to problems nobody else had identified. The other ground crew thought she was obsessive. The pilots thought she was presumptuous. The officers thought she was overstepping her authority. None of them understood that Lena was preparing for a moment she hoped would never come, when her unofficial expertise might be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd learned to read weather patterns that could ground entire squadrons. She could calculate fuel consumption rates that would extend operational range. She understood radar countermeasure tactics that could save pilots' lives in hostile airspace. But officially, she was just ground crew, someone who checked tire pressure and cleaned windshields. That's what everyone believed until the morning when real crisis struck, and Lena's hidden knowledge became the only thing standing between Echo Squadron and disaster. In her notebook, Lena always kept a hand-drawn flight diagram written in blue ink. Wind code, angle 11/17. If no one leads the way, trust physics. The alert came at 0630 hours on a Tuesday that started like any other. All stations, scramble alert. Echo Squadron engaged in Sector 7. Electronic jamming reported. Navigation systems compromised. Lena was in the maintenance hangar, performing routine checks on hydraulic systems, when the emergency klaxon began wailing. Through the hangar's open doors, she could see pilots running toward the operations center, ground crews securing equipment, and the controlled chaos that always accompanied a crisis. Echo Squadron 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons had been conducting a routine patrol along the southwestern border when they encountered unexpected hostile aircraft. What should have been a standard intercept mission had escalated into active combat, and now the squadron was reporting navigation failures due to electronic warfare jamming. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the base operations commander, was coordinating the response from the main control room when the first distress call came through. Base, this is Echo 6 Actual. We have multiple bandits, estimated 8 to 12 aircraft. Our navigation systems are being jammed. GPS is down. Inertial guidance is unreliable. We need immediate flight lead coordination for safe return to base. Lena could hear the transmission through the hangar's intercom system. She stopped working and listened intently. Echo 6 Actual was Captain Matteo Girard, the squadron leader. Professional, experienced, not prone to panic. If he was requesting emergency flight coordination, the situation was serious. The control room was in controlled chaos. The primary flight coordination officer was at another base for training. The backup coordinator was sick with flu. The duty officer was competent for normal operations, but had never handled combat flight coordination under electronic warfare conditions. Echo 6, stand by for flight lead assignment, came the response from base. But there was a problem. The base's automated weather and wind calculation systems were malfunctioning, affected by the same electronic interference that was jamming the aircraft. Without accurate atmospheric data, coordinating 6 aircraft through potentially hostile airspace would be extremely dangerous. Lena set down her tools and walked to the auxiliary control station in the maintenance area. This station had basic radar capabilities and manual calculation equipment, older systems that weren't susceptible to the electronic warfare affecting the main computers. She began calculating wind patterns using raw meteorological data, working through the mathematics by hand. High-altitude wind speeds, thermal updrafts, pressure differentials. She was determining the safest flight path for Echo Squadron's return when an officer noticed her. "Moreau, what are you doing at that station?" Major Richards, the maintenance supervisor, strode over with an expression of irritation. "Sir, I was calculating backup navigation data for Echo Squadron," Lena replied calmly. "You're ground crew. That's not your job. Get back to your assigned duties." Lena looked at the calculations she'd completed. The standard return route would take Echo Squadron through a wind shear zone that could cause control problems, especially for aircraft with compromised navigation systems. The safer route required precise coordination, but would ensure the squadron's safe return. "Sir, the atmospheric conditions—" "I said get back to work, Moreau." Richards walked away, dismissing her completely. Lena returned to her maintenance duties, but she continued monitoring the radio traffic. Echo Squadron was still engaged with hostile aircraft, burning fuel and ammunition while trying to navigate home through electronic jamming and increasingly dangerous weather conditions. 20 minutes later, the situation deteriorated. "Base, Echo 6 Actual. We are Winchester on missiles, low on fuel, and still have intermittent navigation. We need immediate guidance for RTB. Weather is deteriorating and we have injured personnel." The base operations center was struggling. Without the automated systems, they were having difficulty calculating the complex navigation required to safely guide 6 aircraft through the storm system that had moved into their area. That's when Captain Matteo Girard made a decision that would change everything. "Base, Echo 6, Actual requesting specific flight lead, call sign, Ground Angel." The radio went silent. In the operations center, officers looked at each other in confusion. "Echo 6, say again, unknown call sign, negative base. Ground Angel is known to Echo 6. Request she be assigned as flight lead for this recovery." Major Richards, who was monitoring the radio, grabbed his microphone. Echo 6, there is no call sign Ground Angel on this base. Captain Gerard's voice came back immediately, calm but firm. Base, verify with maintenance section. French-Austrian female, approximately 28 years old. She has guided Echo flights before. Richards looked across the hangar toward Lena, who was still working on hydraulic systems, apparently oblivious to the radio conversation. The pieces began clicking together in Richards' mind. 3 months ago, there had been an incident when an F-16 had returned with navigation problems during a night training exercise. The pilot had reported receiving radio guidance from an unknown source that had helped him land safely. The investigation had been inconclusive. Echo 6, are you requesting a ground crew member as flight lead? Affirmative, base. She has the knowledge and capability, and right now, she's our best option for getting home alive. Lena had once guided an F-16 with failed radar through a manual landing using only radio communication, something that had never been officially reported. The pilot that day was Captain Matteo Gerard, who now called her Ground Angel. The story went back 3 years to a training facility most people at G47 had never heard of. Lena Moreau hadn't always been ground crew. She'd been an aviation engineering intern at the European Air Force Strategic Testing Center, working on advanced flight coordination systems and pilot support technologies. Her specialty was emergency navigation and recovery procedures for compromised aircraft. During her internship, she'd been developing protocols for guiding damaged aircraft through manual calculation methods when electronic systems failed. It was theoretical work, research that might someday save lives, but had never been tested under real combat conditions. Until one night when theory became reality. A training exercise had gone wrong. An F-16 had suffered multiple system failures during a night training flight. Navigation down, radar compromised, radio functioning, but with heavy static. The main control tower had lost contact. Standard recovery procedures required the pilot to eject and abandon the aircraft, but ejection over the training area would mean losing a multi-million-dollar aircraft and potentially injuring the pilot during a night landing in rough terrain. Lena had been working late in the auxiliary control room, testing her manual navigation protocols, when she'd picked up the pilot's distress signals on the emergency frequency. The main controllers couldn't establish clear communication, but Lena's auxiliary equipment was functioning normally. She'd made a decision that violated every protocol she'd been taught. Without authorization, without permission, without anyone knowing who she was, Lena had begun guiding the lost pilot home using manual calculations and pure voice navigation. She'd talked him through altitude adjustments, heading corrections, approach procedures. She'd calculated wind drift, fuel consumption, and landing vectors using nothing but mathematics and intuition. The F-16 had landed safely. The pilot had never seen her face, never learned her name. The official report credited the successful recovery to unidentified ground personnel, and the incident was classified to protect training protocols. But the pilot that night had been Second Lieutenant Matteo Gerard, fresh out of flight school and scared enough to remember every detail of the voice that had guided him safely home. When Gerard had been transferred to G47 6 months later, he'd recognized something familiar about the quiet ground crew technician who worked on his aircraft. The way she moved around the planes, the questions she asked about flight systems, the precision with which she performed her duties. One day, he'd approached her during a routine maintenance check. "You have an interesting accent," he'd said casually. "French?" "French-Austrian," Lena had replied, not looking up from her work. "Ever done any flight coordination work?" Lena had paused, wrench in hand. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You seem to know more about these aircraft than most ground crew." That's when recognition had clicked, the voice, the accent, the calm competence under pressure. "You saved my life 3 years ago," Gerard had said quietly. Lena had finally looked up. "I don't know what you mean." "Training exercise, night flight, systems failure. Someone talked me through a manual landing when everyone else had given up." I'm just ground crew, Lena had replied. No, Gerard had said. You're the angel who brought me home. From that day forward, Gerard had quietly included Lena in his pre-flight preparations. Not officially, she had no authority for flight operations, but he'd found ways to check his calculations against her knowledge, to verify his flight plans against her understanding of atmospheric conditions. He discovered that Lena could read weather patterns better than the meteorology section. She understood fuel consumption calculations more precisely than the flight planners. She knew radar countermeasure tactics that weren't taught in standard pilot training, but she remained officially ground crew, prohibited from participating in actual flight operations. Now, with Echo Squadron in danger and the base's electronic systems compromised, Gerard was betting his life and the lives of his squadron on the knowledge of a woman who wasn't supposed to have the expertise to save them. Base, this is Echo 6 Actual, Gerard's voice came over the radio. I need ground angel on flight coordination frequency immediately. We are running out of fuel and time. Major Richards looked at Lena, who was still working on hydraulic systems, apparently unaware that her past was about to collide with her present. Moreau, Richards called out. Get over here. Lena approached the radio station, confusion apparent on her face. Echo 6 is requesting you as flight lead, Richards said. Care to explain how a ground crew technician becomes a flight coordinator? Before Lena could answer, Gerard's voice filled the hangar. Ground Angel, if you're listening, we need you. 6 aircraft, compromised navigation, hostile jamming, weather moving in. Same situation as 3 years ago, but with higher stakes. Lena looked at the radio, then at Major Richards, then at the assembled ground crew who had stopped working to listen. Sir, she said quietly, I have unofficial training in emergency flight coordination. If Echo Squadron needs guidance, I can provide it. Unofficial training? European Air Force Strategic Testing Center. Emergency navigation protocols. I was part of the development team before I transferred to ground operations. Richard stared at her. Why didn't this appear on your personnel file? Because it was classified research. And because when I requested transfer to ground crew, I thought I was done with flight operations. Another transmission crackled through. Base Echo 6, we are at bingo fuel in 15 minutes. Need immediate guidance or we'll have to consider emergency landing procedures. Richards grabbed the microphone. Echo 6, stand by. He looked at Lena. Can you really guide them home? Yes, sir, but I'll need access to the auxiliary radar systems and manual calculation equipment. Do it. Lena moved to the control station she'd been working at earlier. Her hand-calculated atmospheric data was still there, along with projected flight paths and fuel consumption estimates. She picked up the microphone. Echo Squadron, this is Ground Angel. I have your position and atmospheric conditions. Prepare for manual navigation guidance. Captain Gerard's voice came back immediately, relief evident even through the static. Ground Angel, Echo 6 Actual. We are ready to receive guidance. For the first time in 3 years, Lena Moreau was about to do what she was actually trained for. And this time, everyone would know exactly who was bringing them home. Comment CTA. Type I owe a debt if you've ever survived because someone stepped up when no one else could. Echo Squadron, Ground Angel. Begin descent to flight level 200, heading 270, wind compensation 3 degrees right. Lena's voice was calm, professional, completely different from the quiet ground crew technician everyone thought they knew. At the radio station, she'd transformed into someone else entirely, a flight coordinator with absolute confidence in her abilities. Ground Angel Echo 6, descending to 200, turning to 270. On the auxiliary radar screen, Lena could see the 6 aircraft adjusting their formation according to her guidance. She was calculating their fuel consumption rates, monitoring weather patterns, and plotting the safest route home through increasingly complex atmospheric conditions. Echo 2, adjust heading to 265. You're drifting into wind shear. Copy, Ground Angel. Major Richards watched in amazement as Lena coordinated the complex return of 6 combat aircraft using nothing but manual calculations and voice communication. She was performing flight coordination tasks that normally required a team of specialists in advanced computer systems. Echo Squadron, be advised, weather front approaching from the northwest. Increase airspeed to 280 knots to clear the system. Ground Angel, Echo 6, increasing speed. How did you know about the weather front? I've been tracking it for the past hour, Echo 6. Standard meteorological analysis. What she didn't mention was that she'd been performing those calculations during her lunch break, anticipating that the weather might affect evening flight operations. 20 minutes later, the first F-16 appeared on the visual horizon, followed by the other 5 aircraft in perfect formation. Echo Squadron was home, safe, with fuel to spare. As the aircraft landed one by one, ground crews and support personnel gathered outside the hangar to watch. Word had spread throughout the base that the ground crew girl had just successfully coordinated a complex combat recovery operation. Captain Gerard was the first pilot to approach Lena after shutdown. He pulled off his helmet and walked directly to where she stood by the radio equipment. "Ground Angel," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you, again." Lena shook his hand. "Just doing my job, Captain." "No," Gerard replied. "You were doing everyone's job, better than anyone else could have done it." The other Echo Squadron pilots gathered around, each wanting to thank the woman who had guided them safely home. But Lena seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I should get back to my regular duties," she said, starting to move toward her maintenance station. Major Richard stopped her. "Moreau, we need to talk about your actual qualifications and your assignment here." "Sir? You're not ground crew anymore. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to flight operations. We need people with your skills where they can be used properly." Lena shook her head. "I requested ground assignment for a reason, sir. I prefer working on the aircraft, not coordinating them." "Why?" Lena looked around at the assembled personnel, then back at Major Richards. "Because usually the aircraft come home whether I coordinate them or not. But if I don't maintain them properly, they might not come home at all." She gestured toward the F-16s now safely parked on the ramp. "Those aircraft need someone who understands both how to fix them and how to fly them. That's what I can provide as ground crew." Richards nodded slowly. "But you'll be available for flight coordination when needed." "When needed, yes, sir." As the crowd dispersed and normal base operations resumed, a small metal plaque appeared on the auxiliary control station where Lena had coordinated the rescue. It was engraved with a simple message. She was not in the air, but she led the sky. Nobody knew who had placed it there, but it remained on the station permanently. That evening, Lena returned to her regular duties, checking hydraulic systems, testing fuel lines, maintaining the aircraft that would carry pilots safely through future missions. But now everyone knew that the quiet woman with the notebook and the careful calculations was more than just ground crew. She was Ground Angel. Comment, CTA. Type, "I will live well," if you believe some people lead the way without needing to sit in the cockpit. Lena Moreau wasn't a commander. She had no military rank that mattered. Nobody required her to take responsibility for other people's lives. But when radar failed, when data went silent, when flight paths became unclear, she chose to stand up. She didn't need to stand on a platform or wear impressive insignia. She just needed the aircraft to land safely. She just needed the people inside to live. 3 months after the Echo Squadron incident, Lena still works ground crew at Tactical Airbase G-47. She still checks fuel systems and maintains hydraulic pressure. She still keeps her detailed notebooks and performs calculations that nobody asks for. But now pilots seek her out during pre-flight planning. They ask her opinion on weather conditions, fuel loads, and tactical considerations. They've learned that the quiet woman with the wrench and the calculator often knows more about flying than people with wings on their uniforms. The military has offered her pilot training, flight coordinator positions, and promotions to positions of authority. She's declined them all. "I fix things that are broken," she explains to anyone who asks. Sometimes those things are aircraft systems. Sometimes they're navigation problems. Sometimes they're people who are lost. Lena represents something essential that gets overlooked in military hierarchies and corporate structures. Expertise doesn't require permission to be valuable. Knowledge doesn't need authorization to save lives. She learned to read weather patterns because understanding atmospheric conditions made her better at maintaining aircraft. She studied flight coordination because knowing how pilots think made her better at anticipating mechanical problems. She developed emergency procedures because someone needed to know what to do when normal procedures failed. Not because anyone told her to, because it was the right thing to do. The most dangerous moment in any operation, Lena tells new ground crew members, is when everyone assumes someone else is responsible for the important stuff. She's taught them that ground crew doesn't mean ground-bound thinking, that supporting the mission sometimes means exceeding your job description. That being officially unqualified doesn't mean being actually incapable. If you've ever done the right thing when nobody gave you permission, ever helped someone using skills you weren't supposed to have, ever guided others through situations you were never trained for, you understand Lena's story. Real leadership doesn't require rank or title. It requires knowledge, courage, and the willingness to act when action is needed. Lena Moreau proves that some of the most important missions are accomplished by people who never officially qualified for them. And sometimes the safest hands to guide you home belong to someone who never left the ground.
If you believe in stories that honor quiet expertise like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to Ellen Steele Heart Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people creating and sharing stories, not mass-produced AI.